And speaking of working in allyship, I have the pleasure of introducing somebody that I consider a friend and an ally. EVA has been working really closely with the RCMP headquarters in our province for some years. And as many of you know, we have done a number of amazing collaborative things together, such as developing a safety protocol where we're able to fast-track issues that are going off the rails. We've changed policy. We've developed third-party reporting sexual assault policy that allows survivors to report anonymously, if you will. Worked really closely developing that policy with E-Division. And more recently, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been co-training and developing and supporting the development of interagency case assessment teams across BC. There's now 60 of them, and our thanks go out to the commitment and the partnership that we enjoy and have for more than 20 years with our RCMP headquarters. Here to speak on behalf of the division is Chief Superintendent Dave Attfield, and he's responsible for criminal operations for core policing, and he has oversight for provincial programs relating to violence and relationships, as well as enhanced community and Aboriginal policing. He's a member of the BC Association of Chiefs of Police. He serves on several of their committees, including the Violence Against Women Committee, the Mental Health Committee, the Addictions Committee, and the Crown Police Liaison. He's worked in our province for a number of years in Surrey, North Vancouver, and Kamloops. He's been responsible for developing proactive protocols for child abuse and neglect in Surrey and with the Surrey School Board and MCFD, and he has a very long list of accomplishments, but I'll just turn the mic over to Dave and welcome him and thank him publicly again for his friendship and his partnership. Please help me welcome Dave Attfield.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for kind words there, Tracy. That was great. I just want to, I'm here to actually introduce the next speaker, but before I do, I just wanted to introduce this concept. I just made it up this morning, this P3 concept. I'm not sure that it's used for other things, but this one has to do with a particular characteristic that I've noticed among people who really push us to to the next level in this area, which is kind of what's needed, because it's all the low-hanging fruit's been picked. So it's groups like this, and particularly some of the angels that were referred to this morning, that we really need to take us to the next level. So it's people that have passion, people that recognize the power they have to make a change, and the biggest thing is the third P is pushiness. So along those lines, I would like to acknowledge and thank, before I introduce the next speaker, a leader in our area with our over 120 detachments out there, all these fantastic people who work hard every single day to make connections, to build partnerships and help women and families, particularly in some of the most difficult times in their lives. And I'd like to recognize Inspector Barb Vincent, who's sitting over here to my left. Barb, if you wouldn't mind standing up. No, I'm going to put you on the spot and embarrass you a little bit. Barb is the officer in charge of crime prevention services, and she has taken us to the next level all the way across the province. She works incredibly hard, is incredibly knowledgeable and passionate, and she is one of, I think, many people in this room, I think, who are, I guess, maybe clones a little bit of Tracy, who is, I think, a very similar personality that pushes us to the next levels, passionate about the issue. And I think the way forward is going to be tougher than the road we've already traveled, because it's really taking us to the next level. That's the trick. So I'd just like now to introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. David Lissac. He is a researcher and forensic consultant who for 25 years has studied causes and consequences of interpersonal violence. His work is focused on long-term effects of sexual abuse in men, the relationship between child abuse and violence, and the motives and characteristics of rapists. Dr. Lissac has served as a consultant to judicial prosecutor and law enforcement education programs across the United States and has conducted workshops in all 50 states. He consults widely with universities, the force services of the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, and other institutions regarding sexual assault prevention and policies, and frequently serves as an expert witness in homicide and sexual assault cases. Dr. Lissac is a founding member of 1 in 6, a nonprofit agency that serves men who were sexually abused as children. So without further ado, Dr. Lissac, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 1 second here to switch the slides over. First of all, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing as a community. Thank you to EVA for inviting me here today. Thank you for getting me out of the United States. Yeah, you can laugh because I have to go back. So I have been lamenting the fact that what I'm going to be talking to you about for the next roughly 45 minutes is really usually the most depressing, grimmest part of a training that I often do on offenders, and that is focusing on the predatory aspect of especially serial offenders. So I want to warn you that this is not going to be cheery. It's not conducive to good digestion, so sort of do some mindfulness work as you walk over to lunch or wherever lunch is going to take place. And I do want to start off by saying something quite seriously. I'm in a bit of a somber mood this morning. I got word that one of the men that I've evaluated, I do a lot of work on death penalty cases in the United States, evaluating men who are either on death row or facing death penalty trials. And so I got word that one of these men that I evaluated has an execution date now for January 18th, and it will go through. And the reason I'm raising this now is because it's very easy when you hear the things I'm going to be talking to you about over the next little bit to demonize the people I'm talking about. And you know, with good reason. I'm going to be talking about really horrible things that people do to other people. And it's important to understand it and acknowledge it. But the vast majority of these people, these men, by and large, it's mostly men, who commit these acts, these predatory acts, they're damaged human beings. And I think it is important that we not simply put them in a category of, you know, sort of non-human, whatever, specimens. They're human beings. And they're very damaged. Most of these men really have forfeited their right to be among us. But I have actually learned a tremendous amount over 25 years evaluating men who have done horrible things. So I just want to caution you, as bad as this is going to sound over the next little bit, these are human beings, not devils, not sort of evil incarnate and so forth. They're just damaged human beings. Okay, with that, I'm going to give you 3 little snapshots of predatory behavior from 3 different cases that I've worked on over the last bunch of years, going back, I guess, the early 2000s. And the first one is John Gagan. He was one of the priests in Boston. I lived in Boston for 24 years. I was there during the whole eruption of the scandal in the Catholic Church that, of course, actually didn't start in Boston, but it really went into full flower there. And Gagan was one of the priests who was prosecuted. And I worked on a number of these cases. We estimate that Gagan probably sexually abused somewhere between 350 and 500 children, mostly boys, over the course of his offending career. He was, of course, one of the priests that the Archdiocese in Boston kept moving around from parish to parish to parish as these reports came through. And so he had constant access. Gagan's MO was pretty classic. He would move into a parish and immediately find out which were the families within the parish. Oh, well, by the way, first of all, when the diocese in Boston, Archdiocese, moved him around from parish to parish, let me ask you a question. Do you think that they moved him to wealthy upper class parishes or lower class and working class parishes? And so in these working class and lower class parishes, of which there were many in Boston, he was in Dorchester for a while, and Quincy, and areas where there are a lot of working class and poor families. And amongst them, of course, some of those poor families are single mothers raising kids on their own. So these are now mothers who are, of course, completely overtaxed. These are kids who are not being supervised very closely because there's nobody there to supervise them, and they don't have the resources to supervise the kids and watch after them. And this is what Gagan would do. He would pick out one of these mothers and start visiting her in her home, commiserating, being a good priest. And what he was doing actually is observing the kids in the home so that he could figure out which of the young boys he wanted to target. Meanwhile, he's grooming the mother. And my clearest window into this actually came not from Gagan, obviously, but it came from interviewing the mothers, who decades later would still describe, weeping, sobbing, how they were completely fooled by him. And in fact, he would get to the point where he would say to them, I know you're worried about Johnny. Johnny probably is 8 years old. Because even at 8, these mothers were concerned, they live in neighborhoods where there are gangs, there's drugs, and they're worried, their boys are already wandering the streets a lot, and they're worried what's going to happen. They're going to get involved in stuff, they're going to get hurt, they're going to get in trouble. And Gagan would tell them, look, I know you're worried about Johnny. Why don't you bring Johnny over to the church on Wednesdays? No, you know what? No, I'll go pick him up at the school. Okay, tell the school that I'll come by on Wednesdays, pick up Johnny after school and take him to the church, and we'll get him used to the rituals and so forth, and I'll start training him to be an altar boy. And these mothers, all these years later, would describe that moment when they felt they don't have to worry about Johnny anymore. Johnny's going to be safe, because here's literally an angel of the Lord who's going to be taking care of at least one of my children. That is grooming, okay? And that's the whole purpose of grooming. Instilling in your target, in this case, first the mother, right? First the mother, instilling this sense of trust and confidence, which then gives the predator access to what the predator wants access to. And Gagan was extraordinarily good at this and extraordinarily sophisticated. Now, and here's again, I don't want you thinking that he's some kind of diabolical psychopath like you see on television sometimes. This is just a matter of practice. If you do something year after year after year, decade after decade, and it's something that you can call it a little compulsive about, you get good. This is no different than learning how to play the piano or anything else. You simply get good at this. You don't have to be a genius. So, before I leave Gagan, one of the anomalies or just weirdnesses. So I've in the course of my career as a forensic consultant, so I worked on death penalty cases since 1991. So what is it, about 25 years? I've worked on probably about 175 cases. Of those 175 cases, 3 involved men who were facing capital murder cases, charges. 3 men who were sexually abused by John Gagan. And to this day, I have no idea how many other men there are in maximum security prisons across the United States who are Gagan victims. But it's got to be more than 3, because it can't be just that I've somehow met the 3 that there are. So that's Gagan. The next one I want to talk about is another case. This is Skip Reveal. And I'll just put all this stuff up. And I want to talk about Skip because he's also a sexual predator. He also focused on kids. But his MO was so radically different from Gagan's in this respect. Most people think, well, who do these predators target? Disproportionately disadvantaged families. And that's true. Kids from disadvantaged families are more vulnerable simply by virtue of very often they have less supervision, or they live in neighborhoods where there's less supervision and there's more crime. There are more predators in those neighborhoods often. But Skip Reveal, he was a predator in Charleston, South Carolina, and this was his MO. He insinuated himself into the community, mostly initially through the churches. All right, so he portrayed himself as a young man, but a deeply religious young man from a good family, a good Christian family. He was a former coach, swimming coach, and also tennis coach. And he worked at the Citadel, which is a military school in Charleston, South Carolina. He worked in their summer camp for kids. So he was known throughout this kind of sector of the community, which is a large part of Charleston, South Carolina. The families that he plied, unlike Gagan, were not disadvantaged families. Actually, the opposite. What he would do is find boys, young boys, from well-to-do families, where both mother and father were professionals, both working, and in fact, working a lot. And yet these were families, even though the parents were both working and both working a lot, they wanted their kids to have everything, right? Because that's what you do when you're upper middle class and you're raising kids. You want them to have everything. You want them to have all the after-school sports and so forth, but they don't have time to provide that. They don't have time even to drive their kids to these various events and so forth. And so Skip Reveal would come in and insinuate himself into these families and essentially say, you know what, I know your son has some real talent, some real potential as a swimmer or as a tennis player. Why don't I coach him? And he was so effective that two families in the Charleston area actually had him living in their houses. They offered him rooms, and actually one of them a kind of a room in the garage, over the garage. And over the course of his career in Charleston, he sexually abused 43 boys. And the only reason we know it's 43, it's not because 43 boys came forward. It's because when he was finally caught, and this is another one of those sordid experiences where the Citadel was made aware of the fact that he was sexually abusing boys and tried to cover it up, which then enabled him to continue for at least another 5 years. But when he was finally caught, he was one of those offenders who immediately folded and gave a full accounting of everything that he had done over the course of his offending career, naming 43 boys who he had sexually abused. And the investigators who worked on that case had the really terrible experience of knocking on doors to talk to many of these young boys who were now in their late teens or early 20s. The vast majority of these boys refused to talk to the investigators. They literally had doors slammed in their face, go away, never come back. Only a handful of boys agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. It didn't really matter because Reveal had confessed to everything, and he's in prison for basically most of the rest of his life. But it was a very stark reminder that, especially when it comes to male victims of sexual abuse, the stigma is still so powerful, so intense, that not only do boys who've been abused not come forward, even when authorities find out about it, they are loath to identify themselves or cooperate with prosecution. So that's Skip Reveal. The last case I'm going to talk to you about quickly is Shandre Tannis, and this is a serial offender and a predator who focused on adults, on women, on females in the Albuquerque area. And Shandre Tannis, this is a long case, and I'll probably talk about Shandre Tannis in more detail this afternoon. What was instructive about Tannis, and we'll get into this afternoon in more detail, is the initial cases that came forward around Shandre Tannis were two women who reported, one by phone, one in person, to the Albuquerque Police Department. And neither one of those reports would have gone absolutely anywhere. In fact, they were probably the gist of office jokes. They were that, kind of sketchy, blurry, sort of, it's not even clear that what was reported constituted a crime. Absolutely nothing would have been done about these except for the fact that within 24 hours, 2 reports came in independently. And that did pique the interest of one of the detectives. And that started what turned out to be an 18-month investigation. We ended up with 9 victims, plus some other crimes. Unfortunately, what we didn't appreciate is part of Shandre Tannis's MO was threatening his victims. We did not, I don't think we appreciated just who we were dealing with, really. I think if Shandre Tannis had committed 9 stranger assaults, broken into homes and so forth, we would have had a different picture of him, different view of him. But because these are all non-stranger sexual assaults, I don't think it ever crossed our mind that he would be out there literally threatening the lives of these victims. 8 of the 9 victims dropped out of the prosecution. 8 of the 9, all adults. Only a 13-year-old girl remained. That 13-year-old girl, that case went forward, and Shandre Tannis pled to that. And we all thought, well, that's a lucky break. The judge is going to hammer him because in New Mexico, this is sexual penetration of a child. And we went to the sentencing hearing, and Shandre Tannis was sentenced to 3.5 years probation. Because he had groomed the judge. All right, so there'd been multiple hearings. He'd been in that courtroom multiple times with the judge. He's from a wealthy family in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Very good-looking guy. That doesn't do him justice. That's his mugshot. So 3.5 years probation, but Shandre Tannis then proceeded to violate probation 148 times. I got the file at home. It's a pretty thick file. On the 149th probation violation, we forced the judge to hold a hearing. The judge finally violated him, sent him to prison, remainder of his sentence, something like about 1.5 years. So I was watching very carefully, very closely, his release date, all right? Because at this point I was pretty clear about who Shandre Tannis was. I had testified at his violation hearing, which got him sent to prison. He was looking at me pretty fiercely. I just wanted to know when he's out. His release date comes. By the way, while he's in prison, New Mexico has, like many states in the United States, a sex offender registry law, so he had to register as a sex offender. His family challenged New Mexico's laws, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and finally they lost, so he had to register. But when he was released, he's not on the registry, and he's out of DOC supervision, Department of Corrections. He's just disappeared. Nobody knows where Shandre Tannis is, okay, for about 2 years. About 2 years later, we're getting to another illustration of predatory behavior here. I get an email from a United States sailor on a Navy boat in the Pacific Ocean. They do have email on those boats. And the email is, "Dear Dr. Lissac, sorry to trouble you, but I got an email from a buddy of mine back home today who said that there's this guy who's been hanging around with my wife a lot, and he's posing as some kind of financial consultant, and we're all in trouble. This was after the mortgage crisis hit in the States, and we're all in trouble with our mortgages, and it's actually not just my wife, but he's gone around and he's hanging out with wives of other sailors. We're all in trouble with our mortgages, and I'm kind of concerned because the guy's name is Shandre Tannis, and I looked up Shandre Tannis and Google him, and there's this trial in Albuquerque about a Shandre Tannis, and is this the same guy? And I saw your name there in the newspaper account. Could you help me figure out if this is the same guy? Now, so if you understand predatory behavior, right away you've got to be wondering if this is not Shandre Tannis, right? So think about predatory behavior, because this is what I'm going to be talking about when I get into the sort of the more meat of this, is the definition of predatory behavior is predators seek out vulnerability, and they become experts at identifying vulnerability and at figuring out how to manipulate and exploit those vulnerabilities. So here's somebody who was finding vulnerable women in the Albuquerque area and raping them, who's now up in the northwest United States, actually not far from here in Seattle. And he's found another vulnerable group. All right, so now you've got young families. Husband is out in the Pacific Ocean on a Navy boat. Wife is back home. They're in really serious financial trouble. How do you exploit that vulnerability? Well, you turn yourself into a financial consultant. And Shandre Tannis is one of those rare people who qualifies as a psychopath. And what psychopaths do is they think, okay, this is how I can exploit this vulnerability. I'll become a financial consultant. But they don't then look at, MBA programs around the country and try to figure out which is the best one. They want to become a financial consultant by the end of this evening, okay? I know it's funny, but it's true. I mean, literally quite true. So what do? You create the facade of one. And so following that train of thought, I joined LinkedIn in order to do a search, and sure enough, there's Shandre Tannis, and he's still there on LinkedIn. You can look him up. In fact, back then I think he's taken his photograph down. All right, so we find him, and I got in contact with the Seattle Sex Crimes Unit, and they forced him onto the Washington State Registry. That's not the end of the story of Shandre Tannis. A couple years after that, which was probably about 3 years ago now, I was in Seattle doing a training for King County police departments for the sex crimes units there. And I think it was that slide up on the board, on the screen, and one of the detectives in the room literally does a kind of falls back in his chair and comes up to me and says, he's one of my guys. All right, so what they do is they divvy up the sex offenders on the registry to all the different detectives and basically just keep tabs on where these people are in case we need to bring them in. But here's the thing, what he knows about Shandre Tannis is that he was involved in some kind of crime in New Mexico that had some element in it that met Washington State's criteria. He has no idea of the real history of who Shandre Tannis is. And that's the reality. I can't speak for Canada. In the United States, the criminal justice system is so splintered, so fractured. There's so little communication across jurisdictions that it isn't, it's routine for people in one jurisdiction, one department, having no idea who the people are, who they have, who they're trying to monitor. So Shandre Tannis has already beaten severely 2 women in the Seattle area, put them both in the hospital, and guess what? Did they cooperate with the prosecution? None of them did. Neither of them did. And his MO continues. I wish I could tell you that there's a happy ending to this. There isn't. Shandre Tannis, as far as I know, is still in the Seattle area. He's a very dangerous character, and I know we haven't heard the last of him. So those are 3 examples of predatory behavior. And what I want to do now is, and I warned you, this is grim. I want to walk you through, some of the conceptual aspects of this. And to start with that, I've sort of given you my definition. I'll just repeat it. Predatory behavior is the identification first of vulnerability. And actually, there's a sequence to that. What predators do is they identify classes, groups of people who are more vulnerable than others. The next step is within that class of vulnerable people, they identify uniquely vulnerable people. All right, so are children or adults more vulnerable as a group? Children. So there are many predators. For example, sexual predators who focus, their careers are focused on sexually abusing kids, not because they are pedophiles, not because they have a sexual orientation towards kids exclusively, but because kids are more vulnerable, they're easier to prey on, and so that's who they prey on. And in fact, there's a whole area of research now called crossover offending, which has shown us that many of the people that we think of as, for example, child molesters, because we've arrested them at some point or convicted them of molesting a child or children, or of individuals we usually refer to as rapists because they have raped adults. All right? And we think that those labels define their behavior, and it does not. The crossover offending research shows us very clearly that large percentages of child molesters have also sexually assaulted adults, and large percentages of rapists have also sexually assaulted children. And because what predators do is at different points in their careers, they have more access to one group or the other. More opportunities arise. They are after vulnerability, and that will be constantly shifting in their life and what they have access to. So we'll walk through a couple of examples. First, I want to show you predatory behavior in another species, just so everybody can relax for a little bit. So these are African buffalo. And that video didn't work. That was Ted Bundy. So the video, it's only about 2 minutes. I'll tell you what the video shows. It shows a pride of lions scoping out this herd. Now, grown adult African buffalo are huge animals, very powerful animals. Like males are about 3,000 pounds. They've got those enormous horns. They're dangerous. And you will not see a lion just sort of blindly charge into a herd. They go after, in fact, in this video, what they're doing is they go after a calf. Because, of course, calves they're smaller, they're easier to bring down, and so forth. If calves aren't available, which of the animals will they go after? Elderly, sick, yeah, lame, exactly. So, but here's a question. How do lions know which of those animals is elderly or sick or lame? And don't tell me they hack into their medical records. How do they know? Because clearly they know, but how do they know? They observe them. All right. Now, but if I just showed you a film of African buffalo, do you think you could say, oh, there's a lame one, oh, there's a sick one, right? Could you? Don't brag, could you? I don't think so. So what would you have to do in order to be able to do that? Watch them, and watch them, and watch them, and watch. And I have a personal insight into this. I haven't gone to Africa and watched African buffalo for years and years. But when I grew up in Canada. I grew up back east. And for many years, I was a dairy herdsman. I milked cows, all right? And when you milk cows, one of the things you got to be watchful of is mastitis, all right? Do we got any dairy people here in the room? Anybody grew up in a dairy farm? All right, so you know about mastitis, right? So mastitis, it's an inflammation of the udder, and it can, it's dangerous for the animal and also take them out of milk production. So you watch for it, and you want to watch for the early signs of mastitis. And one of the things that you get trained on, you learn as a herdsman is you're constantly looking at these animals, right? And you can tell, after a while you get kind of sick of it, but so you milk them twice a day. So twice a day the animals are walking into the barn and then walking out of the barn, all right? And what you learn is you just keep watching animals and you get a mental picture of what a healthy gait looks like in a Holstein, all right? And once you've got that mental picture, as soon as you see an animal whose gait is altered, you notice it. And so you check on that animal. Because one of the things that happens, Holsteins have been bred for milk for so many centuries, right, that their udders are enormous. And so their hind legs rub the sides of the udder all the time, which is not a problem. Well, maybe it is. I've never talked to a Holstein. But it's not it doesn't hurt the animal unless the udder starts to get inflamed from early stages of mastitis, in which case now there's some irritation, and the animal tries to avoid rubbing the udder, and in trying to avoid it, their gait is subtly altered. And that's what you notice. So all of that is simply to say it's a break from predatory behavior, but it's simply to say that just like we study what we need to study, so do predators, all right? And so do lions. Lions study their prey. Predators study their prey. And that's why in so many of these cases, they have an advantage over us. Us meaning, I work with law enforcement in the United States. It's mostly what I do, and with prosecutors. And we're always up against people who have spent so much of their time figuring out how to find vulnerable people. And in fact, one of the ways they beat us is they pick on people who are just simply not going to report this. And so we don't even have a chance to go after them. They've beat us even before the game started. simply by picking people who are unlikely to come forward and report it. And of course, one of the things that we are really frightened of now in the States, if you're an undocumented individual in the United States, under these circumstances, are you going to come forward and report a crime? No. We have just, as of November 8th, created an entire group of people in the United States who are fair game. All right? And predators know this. Okay. So Ted Bundy, I don't know if the name is as familiar up here as it is in the States. Ted Bundy was executed back in the 80s. Just before he was executed, he gave a lot of interviews, and one of the things he said that people thought was completely outrageous was this: I could tell a victim by the way she walked down the street, the tilt of her head, the manner in which she carried herself, and everybody thought, he's just bragging and so forth. But actually, researchers, several groups of researchers have tried to study this over the years, and a few years ago, there was a study that was published out of the States, and what it was is they went into a maximum security prison, and they picked out a group of, they selected, using a certain criteria, group of inmates, and they showed these inmates videotapes of men and women individually walking down the street, just walking down a normal street, one by one. And unbeknownst to the inmates, they had, of course, questioned, assessed these people, and they knew which of these people had been sexually abused as kids. They asked the inmates to look at the videos and guess which of these people had been sexually abused. And the inmates, wildly better than chance, were able to identify the victims just by watching them walk down the street. Now, you might think, well, how's that possible or whatever? I'm going to actually demonstrate to you what they were watching for, okay? And I'm going to make it easy. I'm going to give you the two ends of the spectrum, all right? So I'm going to give you two extremes, and then we'll talk about it. So I want you to see if you can figure out which I am here. Am I the victim or the not victim, okay? You sure? Okay. Well, that leaves little chance, but all right? So nobody in this room is going to have any trouble identifying, right? All right, so most people are maybe not quite that extreme, right? Most people fall more towards the center of that bell curve, right? If you wanted to get better at being able to detect somebody who's showing signs of having, so what are we talking about? We're showing signs of having had experiences that make you feel, what? Weak, vulnerable, right? And you sort of just look that way, right? And that falls on a continuum. And as you get less extreme in terms of the manifestation of the behavior, you have to spend more time watching people to still be able to detect those more subtle signs. So again, it's all we're talking about is practice. If you are motivated to find vulnerable people, you watch them with this in mind, and you become better and better at doing so. And you don't have to be perfect. You just up your odds of detecting vulnerability and moving in and starting to groom or work on those individuals. Okay. So here things get a little bit more uncomfortable for folks in the room who've got young kids. So there's a sexual predator. He parks his car down the street from this schoolyard, this playground, and watches the kids. And he's probably parked down from this schoolyard not because he is a pedophile, because he is attracted to kids sexually only, but because he has determined that kids are easier to prey on. So that's why he's targeting them. Now, so that's the class of people he selected, kids. But the reason he watches the schoolyard is because he's going to look for kids who are uniquely vulnerable. All right, so if you look at that photograph and imagine, let's say, that distribution of kids in the playground is consistent over time, which one of those kids is he going to start paying attention to? Yeah. And why that kid? That kid's by himself. And if that kid's by himself a lot, what might that mean? He's lonely. Yeah. Maybe he's ostracized. He's not getting along with the kids. We know there are kids who have a harder time socially, right? They have a hard time fitting in. And kids can be pretty cruel. So when that starts, that dynamic starts, sometimes kids really get pushed out. They get rejected by their peers. And you will see kids. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I was part of a research study, which literally we were doing exactly the same thing. We were watching kids in playgrounds and coding those behaviors that signal that here's a kid who is probably getting in trouble socially like this, that he's spending more and more of his time alone and so forth. So we were literally coding the markers of vulnerability, exactly the same markers that sexual predators do. And you can do it. We got pretty good at identifying those signs, just like predators get very good. Now, all right, so he's alone a lot. Why does that make him vulnerable? So somebody said lonely. If this kid is lonely, is ostracized, isn't getting a lot of attention, what does he crave? Attention. And that is the vulnerability that the predator will exploit. Because he's not going to try to, sidle up and grab the kid and drag him out of the playground. He's going to look for an opportunity to approach the kid and start engaging the kid. And when he engages the kid, the predator assumes that this kid has been told in school, by parents, whatever, some strange man walks up to you, go to a trusted adult in the playground, whatever, the whole stranger danger thing. Unfortunately, what many kids, and probably most kids that age and younger, take from that kind of instruction is that there are bad men out there, and you have to be careful of the bad men. Now, do you think that this guy, well, here, do you mind if I use you as innocent as a kid? I'll be back there. Hey, I've been watching you on the playground. You are incredible. I have never seen a kid who can do what you can do on its own. How did you learn how to do that? I mean, you're incredible. You think he's going to experience me as bad? He craves attention. Here's this adult just showering this kind of this attention on him. So right there, if this kid has this sort of trepidation, oh, this is a stranger, and all of a sudden that kind of dissolves. And that gives me my first foothold. All right? And of course, there are many, many other techniques that flow from there, right? Where I draw the kid in further and further. And everybody's heard of the candy routine, right? It's a cliche, and no sexual predator worth his salt would use it anymore. It's so cliche, right? It's actually a very simple, it's a very, and it's not just sexual predators who use this, car dealerships use exactly the same technique that human beings use. Literally the same thing, all right? Because here's the way the routine works, right? My first question after, okay, so I've engaged with this kid a little bit, used this flattery, and then I said, oh, do you like candy? Now, that's a great question, because what kid doesn't, right? So I know the kid likes candy. But look at the dilemma I put this kid in. Let's say this kid is really still kind of worried. He knows he's not supposed to talk to me. When I ask that question, do you like candy? What would the kid have to say in order to break off this exchange? No. And if he says no, what is he doing? Lying. So look at that incredibly simple but diabolical dilemma that I put this kid in. There's no way this kid is going to say no and lie to an adult. But it's such a stupid little question anyway. So you say yes. Of course you say yes. Probably most kids say yes without even thinking. So the kid just said yes. So I go, oh, would you like a candy? Back into another dilemma now. This child has just said he likes candy. And now I'm offering him a candy. What would he have to do to break it off? Say no thanks. But he's just said that he likes candy and I'm offering him a candy. Canada, because it's been a long time since I bought a car in Canada. But in the States, go into a new car dealership, and this is the routine. I swear to God, it's like a playbook. You walk in, some salesman comes up to you and greets you with this kind of phony stuff, and then says, you know what, have a seat. I've go talk to the manager, but we've got popcorn, free popcorn, sodas, coffee, whatever you want, just have some and I'll be right back. Okay, you've had the routine? Okay, so it's Canadian too. And you know what they're doing? All right, there's probably 5,000 dissertations that have been published on this, okay? You create a social obligation. So even though you think, oh, come on, you're not gonna, for free, 3 cents worth of free popcorn, you're not gonna buy a car from these people, right? But actually, all they want is for you to feel like, well, if I take the free popcorn, I can't really walk out, right? I mean, I'm not that kind of person where I walk into a dealership just to get some free popcorn and walk out again, right? They want you to stick around for a few minutes. And that's all they're trying to achieve, because they know that this is a social obligation. It's exactly the same process that I just worked out with this kid. And that's how I get a little hook into that kid. So let's move on to adults. So this is Jeffrey Marsalis, who's fortunately in prison in the States, a serial rapist. Preyed on adults. And what in adult cases, especially adult non-stranger cases, very many of these cases, probably a majority of these cases, begin in some kind of environment where alcohol is being consumed. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the main reasons is that's where predators go to look for victims. And why do predators go to bars, parties, and so forth to look for victims where people are drinking? Because people are voluntarily getting themselves somewhat more vulnerable. I mean, that's just simply biologically true. We are vulnerable to all kinds of things when we become intoxicated. Our cognitive functioning deteriorates and so forth. Now, like the playground, they're not just looking for anybody. So they're looking for people who are more intoxicated, but they're also looking for something beyond that. And this varies. Most of the predators that I've interviewed will not articulate it as clearly as I'm going to you, but functionally this is what they're doing. They're not just looking for level of intoxication, they're looking for the subtle signs that there's a reason why somebody is drinking so heavily. They are picking up on the cues that something's up with that person. Something's essentially troubling them. There's a reason why they are drinking so much, essentially binge drinking. And this intersects with a fair amount of research now in the last, especially 5 years, on binge drinking, and the fact that in colleges, for example, freshman students are much more likely to engage in binge drinking. We also know that students who come to college with a history of childhood sexual abuse are significantly more likely to engage in binge drinking. And of course, we also know that binge drinking is associated, it's a dramatic elevation in risk for sexual assault. There are a lot of factors that sort of come together that yield the following result. In this domain of adult sexual assault, a lot of these predators end up targeting women who have a prior history of trauma. So there's a whole area of research, re-victimization research, which is documented that varies from study to study, but anywhere from women who were sexually abused as children are 3 to 7 times more likely to be sexually assaulted as young adults. And a lot of that research has focused a lot in the past on, essentially what are these women doing or not doing that elevates their risk. Binge drinking clearly is one of those factors, but what is missing from that research is that predators are targeting these individuals disproportionately because of some of the factors that I'm talking about, the binge drinking and because they are picking up on the signs of sort of emotional volatility. Okay, I'm going to keep going here because there's I want to get to a couple more points before my time's up. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the very specific grooming tactics, especially in this domain of non-stranger adult cases. When a predator spots somebody in whether it's a bar, let's say it's a bar, this person's been drinking pretty heavily, so they also want to look for somebody who is not too tied into a group, so they'll watch groups and make sure that there's an opportunity to get alone with this intended target. And then they start testing. So one way you can test somebody's, sort of boundaries is, of course, you violate their personal space and see how they react. But the most common way of testing somebody's boundaries is not to do that physically, but rather to do it verbally. Now, there are an awful lot of women in this room, so I'm going to ask you, think about this question and then raise your hand. Well, I don't know, I don't want to make it public. Just do it privately to yourself unless you want to talk about it. Have you ever had the experience of somebody violating your boundaries by saying something to you, just verbally? Yeah. It's strange. When I teach cops a lot, and still it's very few, mostly in a room now of law enforcement, especially I do a lot of military work, and there's usually maybe a handful of women in the room. And the women, as soon as I ask that question, of course, the men are looking at me, what? And the women are going, yeah. So I'm going to give you an example of this from a case that you may have heard of down here. I worked on the Kobe Bryant case. I worked with the detectives in that case. And there's a perfect example of this from the Bryant case. The victim in that case was 19 years old, worked in this hotel in Eagle, Colorado. She comes to work one afternoon. She's part of the front desk staff. The front desk staff, every day, somebody is appointed to be in charge in case a VIP comes to the hotel. Her time, this was a day when she was in charge on duty for that. She comes to the hotel. Her colleagues come up to her immediately and say, hey, listen, Kobe Bryant's coming to the hotel. You got to get his autograph. And her response is, who's Kobe Bryant? So they explain who Kobe Bryant is. For those of you who don't know, he's an NBA basketball. He just retired. So they give her an index card and a Sharpie, and they say, get his autograph. Bryant and his entourage come to the hotel. She brings them up to a series of suites where they're going to be staying. When she's showed them around a little bit, she turns to Bryant and says, my colleagues asked if you would be willing to sign an autograph, and she kind of reaches out with the index card and the Sharpie, and Bryant takes the index card and the Sharpie, and he says, I'll tell you what, why don't you come back in 20 minutes, and I'll sign the autograph. Any theories? Why? Let's see. How long did that take? So why does she have to come back in 20 minutes? Yes, because he wants to be alone with her. Exactly. Well, she does come back in 20 minutes, comes to his room, and Bryant says, can you give me a tour of the hotel? She says, certainly. Starts sort of walking down the hallway, showing him a couple things within less than a minute. He says, that's good enough. Why don't we go back to my room? So they turn around, they're walking down the hallway back to his room when Bryant towers over her, looks down and he says, hey, it's a nice tattoo you got, because she has a tattoo that's visible. And she was very honest with us, and she said, I was kind of flattered that this, now I know he's some celebrity and he likes my tattoo. That was nice, it was cool. The next words out of Bryant's mouth were this: do you have any other tattoos that I can't see? Where would those tattoos be? Under her clothing. And, it's a little subtle, but boy, did she get it. Because what she told us is, she goes right from that feeling of, wow, that's pretty cool that he likes my tattoo, to whoa. And I think literally the word is, I was weirded out. But she's 19 years old. You can imagine, I remember literally thinking in that moment, so, if she had been 30, there's a chance, even though she's in a bind here. She's employed by the hotel. She's got to be nice to this guy. There's a chance that at 30, she might have said to him, Mr. Bryant, if there's anything else you need, there'll be somebody at the front desk who can help you. I need to get back down to the front desk now, It would take a fair amount of wherewithal, but maybe at 30 you'd do it, but not at 19. So what is Bryant doing there? He's testing. Because if she's that pliant, I'll tell you what the next step in this assault was. They get back to his door. This is happening in the hallway, literally feet from his door to his room. They get back to his room. He uses the key card, opens the door, walks in, leaving the door open, not saying a thing. Just walks right into his room. Now, why is that a move? That's a deliberate move. Why? Yes. So he doesn't stop at the door and say, would you like to come in or anything? No, he just walks in, basically making it impossible. She's going to have to stay at the door or walk away, do something kind of rude, something, whatever. And she, of course, again, she's 19. She doesn't know how to handle this. So, of course, she just feels like, oh, I guess I got to walk in. And that's how he gets her into his room. So this is the level at which you need to understand predatory behavior. It's at these literally micro elements, these micro interactions. And oftentimes, look, predators aren't necessarily to sort of open up their playbook like this, but you can detect this oftentimes by just a very, very careful, open interview with the victim. So right down at the millisecond level of the victim's experience, moment by moment, decision by decision. And that's where you begin to pick up these elements of predatory behavior. What am I down to in terms of time? About 5-ish? Okay. All right. So we have a number of examples of violating personal space. I want to get to this last sort of element of this. There. So again, in non-stranger cases, and I'm focusing on this a little bit because the criminal justice system, I can pretty much say this universally, Canada, the United States, it's true across the board. These are some of the most difficult cases that we face. And historically, collectively, I think I can just say we've done a pretty terrible job of handling non-stranger cases. They are challenging. They're extremely challenging cases. One of the things that we have been very, very slow to understand is just how terrifying these sexual assaults are. And this goes all the way back to 1992. 1992, there was a study that was released in the United States called the Rape in America study. And for the first time, they didn't just document the prevalence statistics and the incidence statistics. They asked a lot of questions of women who'd been raped. And one of the things they asked is, they were trying to get a sense of level of fear. And they found that, I can't remember what the exact percentage of it was over 40% of the victims said they were afraid they were going to be killed. And it floored us. I mean, literally, we looked at this and thought there's something wrong here. Because we were still thinking about non-stranger sexual assaults as this completely different kind of assault. And it didn't make any sense that women would think they were going to be killed. There's no gun, there's no knife, there's oftentimes no overt violence. Why would these women think they were going to be killed? And it's just a marker of just how little we understood this phenomenon. When somebody you thought you knew, somebody from within your social network, somebody from, we all have generally a kind of a safe zone, right? And sometimes it's geographical, but very often that safe zone is interpersonal. So if it's in the army, if it's somebody from your base, that's part of your safe zone. If it's somebody from your university, you're part of campus, that's part of your safe zone. And in fact, if you're at one of these parties or a bar and you're getting yourself somewhat intoxicated, voluntarily drinking, which makes you more vulnerable, you're doing that. I mean, would you do that if you were in the middle of some part of town where you didn't know anybody? I mean, no, you'd be a little bit more cautious. You're in a safe zone. So now somebody you meet in that context, never seen them before, but they seem like a pretty nice guy, and they're nice to kind of offer you drinks, buy you drinks. And then at some point in the evening, he says to you, you know, I think you've had a little bit more to drink. I think you better let me take you home, okay? I don't want to get you to get in trouble and so forth. So, you know, I stopped drinking a while. I'll get you home. And that confirms for you that this is somebody from your safe zone. In fact, this is somebody who is showing concern for you. And so you accept that offer. And he takes you home. And maybe to show your appreciation, you say, you know, you want to come up and, you know, have a cup of coffee or whatever, and sure. And so you go up there. And maybe even things evolve to a little bit of, you know, what I don't know what kids call it these days, but, you know, foreplay, little whatever, right? So there's some messing around. And you're doing this consensually. Knowing that, you know, that's about, you know, there's a limit to what you're going to do tonight. And at some point, you reach that limit. And what is the first thing you do? Well, the first thing you do is not typically, okay, that's enough. The first thing typically is some kind of physical gesture. Closure of the body, a sort of a turning away of the body. And that might sound extremely subtle, but actually there's research, believe it or not, there's research on almost everything. There's research on this. And actually the research shows that people clearly understand these nonverbal cues. And yet the person doesn't stop. And so the next gesture is maybe a little bit more kind of clear, but still he doesn't stop. And so the next thing is maybe some kind of verbal, but it's actually not even verbal, it's a sound. So it's sort of like, Again, now this is even more clear, but still he doesn't stop. So finally there is some kind of verbal message like, no, stop, enough, and he doesn't stop. Somewhere in there is a second when this person realizes they're in real danger. Because everything you assumed about this person you're with, you now realize you were wrong. And this is a terrifying moment. And I'll tell you, this is the last thing I'm going to say about this. It reminds me, and maybe this is just me idiosyncratically, I once met this World War II veteran in the remote mountains of North Carolina. He makes these incredible chairs. He died a few years ago. He was a veteran of World War II. And I had this incredible afternoon with him in his shop, talking about his experiences in the war. And he was at the Battle of the Bulge, Bastogne. One of the things that happened during that battle is the Germans, this was basically the Germans' last desperate effort to stop the Allied advance. One of the things they did as part of this is that they sent in paratrooped German soldiers wearing American uniforms behind American lines in order to basically sow terror and confusion. And it worked. This man, his name was, Averill Woody was his name. Averill's unit was warned about this. And the conditions couldn't have been worse. It was snowing, it was cold, it was foggy, it was horrible visibility, and they were just on alert and they were terrified. And his unit came across a group of soldiers in American uniforms. But there was something about the way they were standing and positioning, and because they weren't supposed to be where they were, that they immediately, Averill's unit said, this is one of those units of German soldiers in American uniforms. And they were literally within this distance of this room from each other. But there was this moment of hesitation because they were in American uniforms. That's not where danger comes from. And that split second of hesitation meant that the Germans opened fire, and several of Averill's friends were hit and killed. And of all the things that Averill Woody suffered during World War II, all right, and he was talk about a stoic guy, this is when he broke down and started crying. He landed at Omaha Beach, D-Day. This is when he started crying. And it is this, when violence, when threat comes from this completely unexpected direction, it is a moment of absolute terror because it completely upends our sense of where we're safe and when we're safe. And this is why non-stranger sexual assaults are so profoundly difficult for victims to get over. Because once that has been shattered, once your idea, your schema of where you're safe has been shattered, it is very, very difficult to put it back together again. And it kind of separates yourself from your peers, right? Because your peers still have, who haven't been assaulted, have that sense of there are safe places and there are safe people. And it's very hard for you now to share in that reality. Okay, so I warned you. I usually try to figure out, like in the last 30 seconds, something somewhat more cheerful to say, but unless somebody else here can, I don't know, tell a joke or something. For those of you who come this afternoon to the workshop, we'll talk about a lot of other aspects of this, including not just the predatory aspect of this kind of offending, but some more of the MO and behavior characteristics, and especially repeat offending and the data on repeat offending. Thank you for listening. Take a deep breath, please, and enjoy your lunch. Thank you.